Greetings and welcome. I am Justavor, bringing you what I hope is constructive information on what the system of racism is and how it works, as well as what can be done to replace it with a system of justice. For more information about the purpose and goals of this channel, as well as some basic definitions of words and terms we use in reference to our work, I have included a link below to a video containing this information. Is white supremacy really the problem? In this video, we will explore the question and some of the major effects of the global system of white supremacy. Justavor has concluded that there indeed exists a global system of racism. We think it would be constructive to explore why some victims of racism may think otherwise. I am reminded of the quote by Mr. Neely Fuller that, "If you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything that you understand will only confuse you."
I said that statement initially, and then after thinking about it for a year or two, I decided I was going to modify it and say, if you do not understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand, I dropped the think, everything else that you understand, that you do understand, will confuse you. And how did I come to that conclusion? Based on logic.
The ancestor, W.E.B. Du Bois, once wrote in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, that the problem of the 20th century is the color line. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing noted this in her book, The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, that just as the problem of the color line, racism, has controlled events in the 20th century and prior centuries, the solution to the problem will regulate events in the 21st century and beyond as we enter the era of justice. We recognize confusion as one of the primary tactics racists use to maintain the system of white supremacy, and that dispelling that confusion promotes a system of justice. This is why Justavor attempts to present information in a manner in which even young children can understand. As we begin, we think one way to dispel confusion is to use words accurately. The first step here is to understand what we're talking about when we say the terms racism, white supremacy, and justice. From the many years of research that I have done on the subject of racism, the conclusion is that the most accurate definition of racism is identical to the definition of white supremacy, which is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and who are dedicated to the mistreatment and subjugation of all those they have classified as not white. There are many definitions used for the terms racism and white supremacy. I have concluded that words are very important, and this definition is the most accurate. I have also concluded that the best way to solve a problem is to get to the source of that problem. One way to understand the problem is to be able to sufficiently analyze and succinctly define the problem, as per Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, in order to effectively neutralize that problem. What racists will do to maintain the system of racism is to keep non-white people from understanding the problem. This way, attempts at solving the problem will result in failure. Using inaccurate definitions and metaphors is one tactic for keeping victims of racism confused. Even speaking around the subject without getting directly to the heart of the matter seems to have been effective in maintaining the system of white supremacy. I think this is why using terms like race, when one really means racism, and terms such as Western world, Western culture, or Western civilization, when they are really referring to people who classify themselves as white, makes for more comfortable conversation than if one were to just say what is really meant. I support the conclusion that race equals racism equals white supremacy. On the other hand, when one does use direct and accurate terms when speaking about the subject of racism, the conversation becomes uncomfortable. But why? Well, no one likes being called a racist. Historically, white supremacists have been responsible for destroying entire civilizations, cultures, and people to the point that white supremacy is akin to a crime against humanity. Mr. Fuller reminds us that the only functional form of racism is the system of white supremacy. Thus, identifying someone as a racist is connecting them to some of the worst crimes that have ever been committed. But is racism really the problem some people try to make it out to be? Does race really matter in today's world? My response is that so much, even in today's world, is defined by or connected to one's racial classification. In a system of white supremacy, those who classify themselves as white do all the classifying. Mr. Fuller. Before going further, we would like to ask the question, what exactly is race? To answer that simple question can easily lead to confusion. The concept of race has changed over time. At one point, race was alleged to be scientific and based on physical or genetic characteristics. In other words, one's race would be classified based on what one looked like or which group or groups their bloodline was connected to. I think the author and victim of racism, J.A. Rogers, noted accurately in his 1952 book, Nature Knows No Color Line, when he pointed out the illogic of using how people look or whom they were genetically related to in order to classify them into a so-called race. Mr. Rogers noted that, genetically, each person could be classified as a race. The evident truth is that each human being is a race, a variety in himself, a variety through which runs fundamental unity. J.A. Rogers, Nature Knows No Color Line. A less confusing response to the question of what race is exactly would be to look at race in a social-political context, without the pseudo-scientific context connected. It is safe to say that race is synonymous with the term organization. We must consider that classifying people into race categories has worked only to benefit those who classify themselves as white. Based on this history, an accurate definition of race is an organization for the purpose of maintaining white control and domination. This view of the idea of race may be uncomfortable for some victims of racism who have been taught to view race as something connected to how they look, whom they are related to, or even what culture or religion they practice. But ending the problem of racism requires searching for the truth, and once the truth has been found, use it to promote a system of justice. There are many uncomfortable truths for victims of racism within the system of white supremacy. The truth here is that there is only one race, and that is the white race. Why does it even matter? Some would ask. People should not care about one's race anyway. This is true. One's racial classification should not matter in a world where people are intelligent and civilized. But if race doesn't matter, why is so much connected to and dependent upon one's racial classification? Why is such information asked for on government forms, such as applications for employment, housing, education, birth certificates, marriage certificates, census and surveys, and so many more? Race first, right? One may claim that it is optional to list such information on these forms, but if it doesn't matter or make a difference in how one is treated or what resources one is allowed access to, why ask for a racial classification in the first place?
The supremacist always does the classified.
We have seen the effects of racial classifications in a system of white supremacy. The counter-racist code encourages non-white people, victims of racism, to use logic in search for the truth. This includes paying attention to patterns. A glaring pattern that can be seen around the world is that of melanin-deficient people being at the top of societies, enjoying an easier life experience, and melanin-enriched people being at the bottom of society, having more problems on average than their paler counterparts. The pattern has basically become pale equals successful, melanated equals failure. This is why white supremacy is recognized as being a global system. Its effects are worldwide.
As a matter of fact, the black people learn, all non-white people over the world learn. If you're black, stay back. If you're yellow, you're brown, stick around. If you're yellow, mellow, white, right. I can go to England and the people can just say the same thing. Doesn't matter whether if you go to the Philippines, because there has been a confrontation of brown with white. Everybody knows the more pigment you have, the more pressure that is on you.
Yeah.
But they didn't understand why. I said the why is for the purpose of white genetic survival.
All right.
So, is white supremacy really the problem? One can consider the 9 major areas of people activities. What major problems do non-white people face in these areas? And can these problems be tied to a system where they are or have been mistreated by those who classify themselves as white? In the areas of economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. What are some of the major impacts on non-white people that are due to the problem of racism? Confusion is one. When one is in a state of confusion, it can be very difficult to understand and find a solution to one's problems. How can you solve a problem if you don't understand the problem? How can one solve a problem when they have been deceived into believing there is no problem, or that the problem is something other than what evidence and logic shows it to be? This leads to confusion, frustration, and the inability to think clearly and solve the problem. Another major impact is conflict between non-white people. This not only further spreads the disunity among victims of white supremacy, but often leads to someone being hurt, dead, or placed in greater confinement. This behavior benefits most the white supremacists who are in charge of the very system non-white people suffer under and are often in conflict about. A lack of autonomy and the ability to decide for oneself how one lives their life and what is best for them and their offspring is another adverse impact of the system of white supremacy. Non-white people have been forced to live according to the will and permissions of those in power, the white supremacists. Mr. Fuller asked the question, if I own you, what do you own? Under a global system of racism, non-white people are not able to enjoy one of the most fundamental rights as people, the right of self-determination. Another impact of racism that I tend to point out is the retardation of the development of non-white people. I often imagine what it would be like if all children were able to consistently and sufficiently have their needs met, and all people were able to develop to their fullest potential. How would all life on earth benefit from a harmonious existence in a system of justice and correctness? White supremacy robs us all of such an existence, only to benefit one group. However, I have faith that justice is inevitable. Sooner or later, and hopefully sooner, white supremacy will end and justice will be produced. What other problems can one think of as a result of the system of white supremacy? The list seems endless. From wealth gaps to dropout and illiteracy rates, to school-to-prison pipelines, to food deserts, brutality and modern-day lynchings at the hands of law enforcement and race soldiers, to confusion surrounding sex and anti-sex, to not getting job interviews because of how unwhite one name seems, to psychological effects like depression, trauma, self-hatred, hopelessness, and so many other problems. We are often taught to look at these problems as if they are the problem. One who is less confused about the system of racism will recognize these to be but symptoms of an overall problem. That larger overall problem is the system of racism. I am not a medical physician, but logic dictates that getting to the root of the symptoms is the best way to address all of the subsequent problems without creating new problems. Replacing white supremacy with justice will lead to the solving of all other problems created by the system of white supremacy. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, in her book, The ISIS Papers, wrote of a unified field theory in psychiatry, which I plan to explore in a later video. This theory explains how seemingly unconnected phenomena are related to a single underlying law governing the origin and continued existence of Western civilization. I would suggest studying Dr. Welsing's unified field theory in psychiatry, as well as all of the ISIS papers, if you have not done so already. Victims of racism are conditioned to accept an inferior position in the system, taught to believe that this is the way things are meant to be and that there is no hope of ending the system. I am reminded by counter-racist logic that systems created by people can be destroyed by people. What are some steps non-white people can take towards ending the system of white supremacy? The code encourages non-white people to minimize all conflicts with other non-white people. In order to do so, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. suggests actions related to such concepts as no contact, no conflict, VGQ, and the 10 stops. These are only a few of the constructive suggestions made by Mr. Fuller. These are just a few steps towards ending white supremacy and producing a system of justice. Justice, as per the code, means balance between people, guaranteeing that no person is mistreated, and guaranteeing that the person who needs help the most gets the most constructive help. If you would like an even better understanding of the code and how it works, please visit producejustice.com to order the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept by Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. I received no proceeds from the sales of Produce Justice or any of the other works I have mentioned in this video. I think that the works of Mr. Fuller Jr. are constructive, and his books act as guides to getting and keeping on code. To view a video of Mr. Fuller explaining the basics of the code, I have included a link in the description for the interview by Danny Queen when Mr. Fuller appeared on Color Me Poetry. If you feel this content is constructive and worth your time and energy, please subscribe to support the making of more content in the future. I am Justavor, and I am still learning. Thank you for watching. Until next time.
Let me say something that gets to the very crux of the matter, and this may be offensive for some to hear who are not on the side that we're on. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.
Say that again.
Let me say it one more time for those of you who didn't hear me. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.